Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those who are on the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you very much for joining us today for this second IGF COVID-related webinar. My name is Isabelle Ramdou. I am a senior associate with the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals and Metals, IGF for short, and I lead our work on local content policies. I will be your host for this webinar for the next 1 hour and 15 minutes or so. Just so you know, the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted online within the next 24 hours on IGF's website and also on IISD's YouTube channel. The webinar is in English only. Unfortunately, we don't have translation for this one, but for the next one, we hope to be able to have French and Spanish as well. So I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll take them at the end of the presentations for the discussion. If we don't have time to answer all the questions that we have because of time constraint, we will post a Q&A blog in the next few days to address them. And then, we will be sending an email anyway to all the people who registered. So stay tuned and we'll tell you when the Q&A blog is up. Okay, let me briefly introduce the program of the day. Today we'll be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on local procurement and how mining supply chains will adapt. In a moment, I will introduce the topic with a few remarks, and then I'll present our guest speakers and our commentators before taking some questions and getting in the discussion. But before we dive into the discussion, I would just like to take a few minutes to share with you an important tool that IGF has recently developed. As many of you know, in 2018, IGF published a guidance document for governments on local content policies. This guidance is a step-by-step tool to support policymakers in designing and implementing local content. The guidance is available on our website in English and French, and then there is an executive summary in Spanish. Besides the guidance, we also accompany our member governments with demand-driven capacity building and training programs with targeted support based on what countries require specifically and based on their policy processes. Now, to complement the in-country support, which we want to be more focused on policies and more targeted, we have developed an e-learning program in the form of an online training. It comprises of 8 modules, and the purpose is to reach a much wider audience that we can do through our regular training. And therefore, I have the pleasure of launching this online tool today and just briefly walk you through a few key steps so you can go and use it after the webinar. So as I said, there are 8 modules, which reflects what is contained in the guidance on local content. Just in a nutshell, the modules provide you with a basic knowledge on the definition and the key context, the key concepts behind local content, the different steps to be followed when you design a local content policy, the scope and coverage of local content. And then there is a toolbox that contains the various regulatory instruments and incentives that government can use when designing local content policies, as well as accompanying measures that may be necessary to implement those, the pros and cons of each type of policies. And then we have about 29 case studies that look at the successes and failures of different local content policies. All those are available on our website. The e-learning platform is free, and it can be accessed anywhere you have access to internet. I'll just show you, okay, let me just show you how it works. Right. Okay. Right, this is the IGF website. So how do you access it? You go to IGF website, you see here there is rule local guidance for government. Click on that, go to local content policies. This is the web page for all the documents that we have on local content. You have 4 squares here, one here called e-learning course. Click on this. It sends you to the specific page for the e-learning. Here you have the background and the objectives. You can scroll through it. You read what the different modules are, etc. And then to sign up for the training, you click on this little yellow button, sign up. It will give you a box. So it sends you to the web page. And then here you see, if you, I have an email, so I can go directly. But since you don't have an account, you click on sign up for free. Click on sign up, then you fill in the instructions here, enter your email, create a username and a password. Then once you create your account, it will send you in your email a welcome to IGF. This is, I did it already. So you will receive this email. If you don't, check your spam because you're supposed to receive it. And then you confirm your account. Once you confirm your account, it will give you access to the training. Just to say that the training is self-paced. Let me go back to, right, okay. The training is self-paced. It means that you can do it at your own time. If you don't have time to finish one particular module, you can stop, save it, come back to it later whenever you feel you want to finish it. It's very intuitive, it's very user-friendly. There are clear instructions, and so you can do it at your own time. The first module is just a general introduction to the guidance, but all the other modules are related to the specific types of local content. And then we also have self-assessment tests for you to check the knowledge gained for the training. So I just encourage you to have a go at it, have fun with it. Feel free to share it with your network, and then send us feedbacks and questions if you have any, and we'll be very happy to help you take the training. Okay, so let us get back to the business of the day. As we've all noticed by now, the COVID-19 pandemic is a watershed moment for the global economy. What started as a major health concern has now extended to become one of the worst economic crises of the past 100 years, with wide-ranging social and humanitarian consequences. The mining sector has not been spared. The pandemic has created a shockwave of disruption, locally and globally, with unprecedented consequences on various fronts. And just to highlight some of them, our speakers will go deeper in that in a while. We've seen major operational disruptions. Mining activities have halted or slowed down significantly in many countries, either as a result of national lockdowns or due to initiatives taken by mining companies themselves to protect their workers from the virus spread. And this has caused several disruptions in mining production and supply. At the same time, global demand for mineral commodities have dropped considerably because of global manufacturing slowdown in industrial countries. Thirdly, we've also seen a knock-on effect on global and local upstream supply chains. No or limited industries means no or limited inputs provided. And last element I wanted to mention, the collapse of global industrial demand has taken a toll on the price of key metals, with sharp declines in the price of metals such as copper and zinc. Gold, on the other hand, which is a safe haven during crisis, price has gone up. These will certainly affect production and investment decisions in the next few months, again with impact on supply chain. So here is the concern. Traditional supply chains have been designed around the optimization of cost competitiveness. To some extent, this has contributed to the development of increasingly complex, interdependent, and globalized supply chains, with multiple sourcing as a key feature. But at the same time, in an attempt to capture part of the procurement market for local businesses, many governments have enacted local content policies and have provided targeted support to local industries to take up the opportunities. Now, COVID-19 has underlined a critical weakness of these strategies. One, high exposure on multiple external sourcing limits the margin of maneuver to manage risk at short notice. This leaves little time to prepare, adapt, and respond to secure supply. Secondly, at the local level, the viability of domestic suppliers, and in particular SMEs, which are often supported by deliberate mandated local content policies, are at risk due to reduced orders and uncertainty about the resumption of mining activities. The purpose of this discussion today is to look at the impact of the pandemic on domestic and global procurement and supply chains. We will talk about the resilience of those supply chains, what new thinking is needed, or strategic initiatives are being taken, both from a corporate and a government perspective, to reduce such risk in the future. What new approaches or trade-offs should government and mining industries consider collaboratively, including to reduce the complexity of supply chains and localize or regionalize some of the critical supplies? To discuss these issues, we have with us two speakers whom I want to thank for kindly accepting to sharing their views with us. We have Jeff Geipel, the founder and managing director of Mining Shared Value, Engineers Without Borders Canada. Many of you know him already. Jeff has worked on many initiatives to improve the development impact of mining activities in host countries. We also have the privilege of having Dr. Ousmane Ilboudo, the permanent secretary of the West African Mining Activities Week, in charge of the promotion and development of mining sector from the Ministry of Mines and Quarries of Burkina Faso. Dr. Ilboudo is also the chairperson of the board of National Small Scale Mining Agency. We also have two commentators who will share some thoughts with us. We have on the line Souleymane Kone, the CEO of the Ghana Chamber of Mines, and Kafiku, Senior Advisor, Economic Development and Local Content from the Department of Government Relations at Shell. So let us start with a global picture. Jeff, if you agree, I'll start with you. Global mining supply chains are being challenged by factory shutdowns and other logistical difficulties. This raises a number of questions, notably regarding the sustainability of the strategy to focus mainly on the cost of inputs and the risk of weakening the resilience of those supply chains due to overdependence on global sourcing. Tell us more about the trends that you have seen so far, and in particular on the impact that global supply chain disruptions have had on the sector. Do you expect this to be a temporary feature, or do you think it will change the way the industry sees its supply chain management moving forward?
Great, thanks very much for having me today, and obviously it's on everyone's mind. I think the impacts on supply chains were absolutely instant. It's quite amazing that I think the PPE shortage in hospitals, I think, was the first time many people even thought about these kind of things, and I think that that made it a society-wide concern. But in the mining sector, these things came pretty quickly, and I have a couple of examples from my own network of colleagues, and one said that their best drilling service providers were actually international providers, and they can't get to the mine right now, and that means their productivity is down overnight, and there's no reason to expect they'll be able to travel to that country anytime soon. Another example was a shipment of PPE being delivered to a mine site, essentially being taken by the government and reused for the healthcare system. So these things happened very much overnight. And this realization that the interdependency of these supply chains goes upstream too, because all the suppliers in these countries who may have only had one buyer in the form of a mine site are now essentially without revenue. And some companies like Anglo American in South Africa have done a pretty good job of payment holidays and that kinds of things for loans to businesses. But overall, we're seeing a lot of suppliers who have essentially no business all of a sudden overnight. And in advanced countries, like Canada, for example, we have relief schemes from the government who are providing wage subsidies for small businesses, and in the UK to furlough workers. But those systems don't exist in many developing countries, and frankly, they don't even exist in a professional way in the United States, where their small business administration was completely overrun with requests. So if you were an SME in the mining sector, supplying a mine in Nevada for that matter, you would still be in a similar situation to some developing countries. So that was the kind of instant effect we had. I think this diagram from EcoVadis, I think, does a pretty good job of kind of explaining what's going on. People are kind of reacting in a very frantic way to the supply chain challenges, understanding what that means. But I think that, you know, aside from a few mines who work in very difficult environments with, you know, frantic trade policy and embargoes and that kind of thing, you know, most mining sector professionals were not used to this kind of thing, and so they had some frantic reactions to this issue, and now slowly we're getting kind of, you know, systems are in place to manage that risk. But I think the kind of exciting part actually is that this is probably going to lead to some real deep thinking about how mining companies procure things going forward. There's going to be a rebound phase where they start trying out new models, and then essentially this will be the new normal. And I think that you're going to see the same thing happen in healthcare and PPE production. You're already seeing countries wanting to have more PPE made in their own home countries for the sake of healthcare. I think we'll see the same thing on the mining side. You know, we're going to need to find ways to adapt, and there's going to be some winners and there's going to be some losers from that change. So that's kind of what I would say is you're going to see a lot of companies and governments working together to kind of assess their own supply chains for the first time in really great detail to manage this risk.
Right, thanks a lot, Jeff. I'll come back to you in a moment to go a bit more in detail on the resilience of the supply chain. But before I do that, Usman, thanks for joining us. Like many developing countries, most mining companies in Burkina Faso, where you are, rely extensively on global supply chains for the procurement, including for those critical supplies. And Jeff was mentioning PPE earlier. I think this is probably the one that everybody has in mind when we think about critical supplies today. What has been the impact of the disruption resulting from the pandemic on the operational activities and volumes of production of mines in Burkina Faso? Was there an impact on local suppliers as well? What has been done to insulate the SMEs?
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to this webinar. So before I get to the question, let me introduce to you briefly the mining sector of Burkina Faso. To say mining sector of Burkina Faso is mainly dominated by the production of gold. We have 14 industrial gold mine and 1 industrial zinc mine. The amount of the gold produced in 2019 was 50 ton, which represents about, with the zinc, which represents 72 15 annual revenue for the country, 15% of the annual revenue of the country. You can get from this data that the mining sector is very important to Burkina Faso economy. So coming back to the question, for the impact of the COVID-19 on the supply chain regarding to Burkina Faso mining sector, I can say, as Jeff mentioned before, that the mining company used to work in high-risk area. So they have, in Burkina Faso, they have managed to still in production because they have stock, security stock. So they're still using this stock, security stock. But if the situation remains for longer, it will be very critical for them. So fortunately, things are going better. I mean, China is coming back progressively. The industries are reopening. Maybe if we are lucky, things will be more normal here. Then it's also important to mention that in Burkina Faso we didn't impose a total lockdown. So that means the borders were still open for the freight and so on. Also, the good thing is that the gold price now is very high. So all the mining company want to steel production, so to take advantage. The problem was the small scale mining, because as the border was closed, the mining brokers, the buyers couldn't get to the country to buy the gold. So it was also maybe, a chance for us, for the state, because we faced in the past to the gold smuggling. So now, as the buyers cannot get to the country to buy the gold, the state take the decision to collect this gold product by the artisanal mines. So it's also a good thing for us. Coming to the small, medium enterprises, yeah, they are very impacted, because here we don't have a local content policies like that. The regulation is not in place, so everyone is free to buy in international markets. So the problem was that the local supplier don't have enough money to compete with the mining company. So it's very difficult for them now, because they cannot get in the international market, because the commodity price also increase. So the government also take some decision to support them in terms of taxes and VAT exemption. So for the moment, we are still managing good, but if the thing remain like this, it will be difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Usman. Maybe just a small follow-up question before I go back to Jeff. You were mentioning the measures that your government have taken to support SMEs. Can you just elaborate a bit on that? You mentioned VAT exemptions. What exactly were the measures that the government did to support the SMEs?
So for the taxes exemption, is like they have in terms of income taxes. Now the SMEs can pay the income taxes later, when they are good enough to pay it. So also the VAT, they have some reduction, so to help them to compete with the international company in terms of international markets. Some of support the government is giving, but they are looking at case by case. It depends on what you need and what your what the difficulties you have.
Okay, thanks a lot. Jeff, maybe just to go a little bit deeper into the local dynamics. We've seen that COVID has exposed the complexity of mining supply chains and the risk of over-reliance on global supply chains. How do you see, how do we reduce this risk to improve the resilience of supply chain? I think this is a major question. You were talking about that earlier. Do you see this as an opportunity for local suppliers, and where do you see the most potential?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I mean, all these dynamics involve winners and losers, right? And so some of these changing supply chain patterns are going to help some, and they're going to hurt others. You already seeing in the example of workplace culture, the idea that not everyone has to go to work necessarily. Twitter just announced today that their employees, for example, could always work from home going forward. And I've already talked to some mining company people who, have basically been saying, we don't actually have to be at the mine site for every individual task. And so you're going to see, I think, some shifts in that. And that has implications for transportation services for those people, for flights and that kind of thing. There's also the idea that if this is a health and safety risk, which I think in many ways is why the mining sector has has kind of moved quicker than other sectors is because they're so used to health and safety as an issue. The drive for automation is now bigger, because if you can run mines remotely through automated technologies, you don't have to worry about the risk of an employee not being able to get to that mine. And of course, if there's automation, that means there'll be likely less jobs and less spin-off benefits in terms of procurement for those jobs. So, those are probably some examples of winners and losers there. But I also think on the supplier side and host country side, there's huge potential for benefits for local suppliers, because now mining companies have a business case interest in hedging the price of pandemic or other disruptions into the procurement costs. So going back to that example of the company that has a problem with productivity because of lack of skilled drillers, they would be in a much better position if they had local drillers available to do the work. If there was a local service provider who could do that work reliably, they would be saving, there'd be a huge benefit in terms of their productivity and therefore their overall profits. So I think there are going to be opportunities for the mining sector and governments to identify which products may actually be suitable to try to make locally on a business case front, so that the businesses actually have an interest with the government to build up those supplies. And I think you'll, in the same way that you'll see a desire for locally made PPE in healthcare, the same thing can be done for mines. And you have to think that there's a lot of products that there's really no reason why they can't be made locally. It's just a matter of patterns, right? Particularly in Southern Africa, you'll see very common to have supply chains that all head back to South Africa, South African procurement staff, working in places like Zambia, and they just sort of have been supplying because that's how they've been supplying forever. And now this kind of thing really brings up the idea that if it can be changed at a similar or even a slightly higher cost, you're going to see a lot more movement towards that. If you go to the slide, I think a second slide with a data table, I think one kind of the point I would like to make is that this one right here, you can't really understand any of this this risk, this potential, these opportunities unless you have the data. And to be honest, very few companies have much detailed data on this. And this is a really good example of a company that has that data. This is from Diavik in Northern Canada, the Rio Tinto mine. And you can see their breakdown of supplying. They've broken down their supplies into a number of categories of goods. They've broken it down by northern indigenous versus other northern meaning non-indigenous, and then in southern means the rest of Canada. But the point is here, even though this is not a direct, you can't directly link each one of these products to whether they're susceptible to a COVID or a pandemic-related disruption, you can get some ideas as to where the opportunities might lie and where they don't lie. But to be honest, most mining companies do not have this kind of detailed data. They might have their procurement spending broken up by supplier, not good or service. You have other cases where it's only goods and they don't have any idea where they're coming from in terms of the import profile. So I guess my kind of message to both governments and companies is, without the data in terms of the types of goods being bought and what amounts, it's going to be very difficult to build up resiliency and to identify those opportunities. So I think data is the starting point. And like I said, there will be winners and losers, but we won't even know which ones those are until we have a better analysis.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Ousmane, Burkina is working on the development. You were talking about that earlier, that you don't yet have a local content strategy, but Burkina Faso is working on developing one of those strategies to boost procurement. How do you see the dynamics we've just discussed now affecting your policy choice as a government? Is the industry rethinking its localization strategy to reduce exposure? Have you discussed that? What is the thinking? Has the thinking changed? I think you should unmute yourself.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I was saying that this situation is also an opportunity for us to discuss with the mining company in terms of local content policy. So we are planning to meet in next week to discuss about this local content policy we are drafting. So in terms of strategy, it would also be good for the mining company to help the, to support us in terms to build capacity of the local supplier to have all the commodities in the country. Maybe we can think sub-regional with Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, but because I know that we can also manufacture everything here, because we have also some natural limitation. So, but the products we can make here, we can manufacture here. It will be good for us to do it here. So it will be very closer to the mining company. I think it will help us to discuss friendly with the mining company, and we also take all the lesson we learned from this situation, from this pandemic crisis, to have a good local content policy. We're still busy on it, so for me it will be very helpful, this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Usman. May I also ask participants if they want to ask questions? There is a Q&A function. If you look at the bottom bar, the far right, you have something called Q&A, and you can post questions there. I already see we have 2 questions, so before posing the questions, I'll now invite our 2 commentators from industry to share some of the thoughts, and then we will have a discussion. So Suleiman, thank you very much for joining us. The Chamber represents mining industries in Ghana, which is the largest gold producer now in Africa. Gold is perhaps one of the rare commodities, and Usman was mentioning earlier that is being favorably impacted by the circumstances because of the price, despite the fact that the industry itself is having exactly the same difficulties with health issues and with access to inputs for its operational activities. Can you maybe tell us how the supply chains of your member companies have been impacted? And how do you see the change in the local procurement strategies that Ghana has? I mean, we just heard earlier Usman saying they're thinking of developing it, but in Ghana, you do have a policy in place. And is there going to be a rethink of that strategy given some of the challenges that you may be facing?
Thank you very much, Isabel. Nice to meet everybody virtually. Very good question, very good discussions about the impact of the COVID-19 on businesses in the mining industry, particularly supply chain. Yes, it is true that in some way, the mining industry in Ghana has not been that impacted, especially when you're looking at the price of gold. About 98% of mineral production in Ghana actually comes from gold. So if you're looking at from the revenue perspective, the price of gold has held relatively firm compared to other commodities. So that is something which is good. But of course, to realize the benefit of that high price, naturally you need to have production to back it. And one of the challenges of production has to do with supply chains. Over the years, mining companies, not just in Ghana, have actually relied strongly on their various supply chains. Albeit in Ghana, most of the supply chains you would find domiciled in Ghana. But then again, there are other critical inputs. For example, you have your activated carbon, you have your grinding media, a large part of grinding media, and caustic soda and sodium cyanide, all imported into the country. So essentially, once these are imported and you have a pandemic which has actually affected, manufacturing production globally, then impliedly you would be affected as an industry or as a company. And it is for companies now to start reassessing the impact of the potential shocks in their supply chain as a result of COVID. on some of these strategic, inputs. So, for example, we know that the supply managers within the industry continue to engage, albeit virtually, engaging with each other to really understand, how the impacts are actually affecting each mining firm and what lessons they can learn. We have a tradition within the industry, and I don't think that it is, peculiar to the mining industry in Ghana, where, for example, companies would want to, share stocks. So, for example, even before this pandemic, if a company runs out of stock, critical stock, not through negligence, but sometimes you have these default situations. Sometimes you have to rely on a neighboring, firm, gold mining firm, next door to provide a particular input. Feeling that sometimes you're able to go down to a fabrication unit within country, and sometimes they're able to help. So, in a nutshell, the COVID-19 has impacted the industry, i.e., not at the revenue side, but more in terms of the operations related to supply chain. But I think the companies are holding fairly firm. I know there are situations where, for example, to ameliorate the potential, fallout of this COVID-19 as it relates to global value chains, companies, like I said, looking at even their procurement practices, whether in the short term, they can change some of their policies. For example, you are looking at your reorder levels, you are looking at your minimum stock levels, and so on and so forth, working collaboratively with the various suppliers to ensure that you have a little buffer. Once you have buffers and companies are paying for depending upon the relationship you have with the vendor, what it may mean is that, look, your working capital would have to go up because you're building up more stocks. But when you have a situation where your revenue is healthy, I'm sure companies in the short term will be more than willing to ensure that they have adequate stocks of critical inputs to ensure that they can continue to produce the mineral, rather than just looking at just the cost of holding these stocks. Again, when it comes to the lifting of the gold doré itself, that is another challenge as well, because you had a situation where borders were locked, the usual flights coming in country to come and take out this doré to various jurisdictions for refining. Some countries are actually locked down, and therefore, what do you do? I know the LBMA, for example, which certifies these refineries, have been engaging intimately with these refineries, and companies continue to, manage that aspect of their business. For example, if I know in the past, the refineries in Switzerland, for example, most of them were actually shut down. I'm not too sure whether they are reopened now, but speaking with LBMA, we got the impression that they were speaking with the mining firms to ensure that they can make alternative arrangements to take their gold doré to other refineries for refining. For example, in Ghana, a number of the mining firms would refine their doré with Rand Refining, which is actually in South Africa. We know that South Africa also had a shutdown. Rand Refining, thankfully, was given an exemption by the government of South Africa. But then you have a situation where the border of Ghana itself has been locked up. So although Rand Refining could refine for gold mining firms in the country, there is a little challenge, because you can't even use the same supply chains, i.e. airlifting through commercial flights to go into South Africa. And therefore, again, you have to step back and think through, out of the box, what do you do? The alternative generally will be chartered flights. And if you are going to go by chartered flights, naturally that will be more expensive. But like I'm saying, if you have a situation where the price of gold is actually sticking up quite beautifully, then in order to sustain production and getting revenue, you may compromise on some of these extra costs to be able to actually continue to do your business. So I think when it comes to the local procurement situation, the local procurement plans of mining companies, I think it's early days yet to really ascertain how this will be impacted. We've not opened up conversations with Minerals Commission regarding how this would impact the individual procurement plans of the mining industry for now. Because like I have said, it's too soon to really say definitively how this will be impacted. We, for example, have some mining companies buying, for example, grinding media and various inputs on the procurement list. If, for example, they have to import some intermediate products for them to add value within country, and some of these suppliers have shut down the operations, then naturally it's going to affect, the compliance with the local procurement plans. And it's about reasonableness. If the companies can, for example, demonstrate that they've had genuine challenges with their supply chains, then I believe that working with Minerals Commission, we should be able to come to a middle ground. So for us as a chamber, we don't believe that nothing has changed. We don't believe that so much has changed. We believe that, look, whether COVID-19 or not, local content, local procurement, initiatives need to be taken seriously, because the closer the supply sources are to the mining companies, the better. And we have seen it with COVID-19. So wherever, as an industry or as a country, we have a competitive advantage to produce, I think it's something we should go for. And I like what Osman has been actually talked about the regional value chains. It's something we as a chamber has been advocating. We're saying to ourselves that, look, it is not everything you can produce for a market like Ghana exclusively, because sometimes or oftentimes the markets tend to be quite small. But thankfully, we have a situation where we have a growing number of gold mining companies within West Africa, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Ghana. We can bunch together. Even Nigeria is also coming up quite strongly. Bunch together and ensure that we are able to produce for these larger markets, for within West Africa. So, like I said, yes, there's a wake-up call, but I believe there's also early days yet to really ascertain the full impact of this on especially the local procurement plans, which are actually enshrined in law. They are statutory, and it's important that we actually engage with the Minerals Commission going forward regarding what this impact would be. Thank you very much. This would be my opening comments. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Suleiman. That was great. We have Kathy with us on the line from Shell, from the oil sector. And it will be interesting to hear how, the strategic thinking of the oil sector is changing or not to prepare for the recovery and to increase the resilience of supply chains. Kathy, can you tell us what opportunities you see for increased local content in the oil sector, if there is any, and if you think that the pandemic is going to change things in the longer term?
Hi, Isabel. Thanks. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Just wanted to connect a few of the dots that the various speakers made, so Osman and Dr. Kony and Jeff. Really relevant points, and just a few observations on that. From the government relations side, we do see that, just as mentioned earlier, that governments are trying to respond to support their SMEs. So we have seen that various government policies have been put in place to defer tax payments, to try and prioritize sourcing from local companies, single sourcing, etc. And so the level of government response to supporting SMEs and local content varies depending on the country. So we very much see that as Shell. I don't know if I can speak for all of the oil and gas industry, but that's definitely a trend that we have seen in Shell. I think, Jeff's slide from EcoVadis in the 4 phases of the supply chain response, I think is really a good way of thinking about it, because where is Shell and where is the world probably at the moment? I think we're probably in the reaction phase and trying to prepare for resilience. And we see this because governments around the world don't even know what to do about COVID. So from the UK government to the Pakistan government, It's what is the messaging on lockdown? When are we coming out of it? And that also makes it difficult as a company to respond in the medium and long term when you don't know when this will end. So Shell's very much at the moment, in the reaction mode. And if you see some of the initiatives that we've done globally, we've donated $3 million to Mercy Corps to try and help the most vulnerable communities from Myanmar, and beyond. But the response has very much been local, because the situation of COVID in each country is very local. So the U.S. response, we've been, giving money to local communities, NGOs, have very, very, very local responses, say in Louisiana. And then the speed at which we can respond to COVID crisis and realign our local supply chain depends on the government. So in the Netherlands, in Kenya, there was a very strong pull to produce hand sanitizers, and Shell had facilities in those countries where we could refit our midstream petrochemical manufacturing to produce hand sanitizer by producing the main ingredient, IPA, which is a fossil fuel derivative. There is no substitute for that. So the reaction in terms of how we retool locally is definitely specific to the country, the government ask. I think the other thing that we can't take for granted is that we, especially working from home, are very reliant on home cooking, on making sure our internet works, the lights are on and everything. And so you can't underestimate the importance of just maintaining continuity of the existing supply chain, whether it is a global supply chain or local. So if you look at our Badr gas project, we produce LPG there along with the government and a Japanese investor. 80% of that country's energy needs come from our asset. So being able to ensure continuity of our supply chain is absolutely critical. So we cannot underestimate the amount of effort required for reaction to a very uncertain situation at the moment. If we move into the resilience, so Jeff's second phase of resilience, I definitely agree with Osman and Dr. Koni's comments about regionalization of supply chains. But again, I don't think that there's anything new in that trend, because we had always seen that nationalization drive was increasing, industrialization policies were being put in place. Isabel, you spoke about this last year, that if you look at the world map, the trend towards more stringent local content requirements was increasing. Now, does COVID accelerate that? Absolutely. So if I was listening to the BBC this morning, and India was saying, look, we need to reactivate our domestic supply chains. We used to produce PPE, we used to produce pharmaceuticals, but because of the efficiency of supply chain, we were importing all that stuff from China. And when there's not enough of that, when efficiency of supply chain is no longer the driving force, i.e. lowest cost, but continuity of the supply chain becomes so important, I expect that we would see that governments will say, look, we are interested in continuity and security of supply versus just the lowest cost. And that's not just in India, we've seen it in Europe. A lot of the stuff that we imported based in the Netherlands from China was, not of the quality that we wanted. So there are a lot of calls for localization of PPE, no matter what the cost was. So, that is the trend where I see that we're headed. And as a company, Shell was already sort of aware through government policies and through our own agreements with government that the need for localization was increasing. And I think that we will expect to see more of that. And if we're talking about the rebound stage, we are looking, very closely at our supply chains, obviously for the short, medium, and long run, and trying to adjust appropriately, especially given the fluctuations in the commodity prices. And, is this lower demand in oil and gas and fossil fuels going to be a permanent one as governments switch over, especially in European and Western governments, to low carbon energy sources? When is that going to happen, and how fast?
Thanks a lot.
Isabel? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I was probably, so I'm looking at a few questions because we have about 20 minutes left for a Q&A, and I'm seeing a few questions coming up, and I'll maybe, since you are on the line, Kathy, maybe bounce one to you, which is kind of very relevant to the situation that the oil sector has been living currently with the plunge of the price to almost negative level. So somebody's asking a question whether the current situation for, especially for small and medium enterprises that are meant to provide local content along the value chain, where the prices have severely plummeted, whether those have been severely disrupted, and if you can share, if you have any concrete experience or cases, what the scenario look like on the ground for the SMEs that supply you or supply your contractors, where in places where maybe a production has been shut down because of the situation, the geopolitical situation. Has there been anything that you've seen out of it, and can we maybe hear from you on that?
Yep, Isabel. I mean, again, it's the response is very local, and so I can't go into all the details of what we've done in each community. But what I can say is that, I mean, we have been encouraging, first of all, supporting all of the SMEs in the country, including the ones that supply directly to us, is just not a realistic thing for one company to do. So we have been encouraging our local focal points to reach out to the various donor agencies and to have dialogues with the suppliers on what their needs are. The responses have been very different. So there are discussions about payment terms, there are discussions about loans, do you support the big companies or small companies? And again, it goes back to, what is the capability of the SME to do something to help, say, retool some of their facilities to impact current health needs. So, in the Netherlands, you would say that there was a need very clearly articulated by the government for hand sanitizer. And so as Shell as a company could say, well, we can help do this, and it supports all of the distribution networks around us. Okay, but those SMEs have to be ready also to retool themselves. And so the question then is, if they are not ready, is it in the middle of a pandemic that you make those SMEs ready? Answer is probably no. But then the question is, whose job is it to help build the capacity of SMEs? It's probably a combination of both, donors, governments, corporates, but identifying the capabilities is definitely something which has been an ongoing challenge, which we faced as a company, as an industry, and I'm sure which governments face. So it's sort of a three-pronged approach between government, corporates, and also other donors that are operating in the country.
Yes, thanks a lot, Kathy. I'll probably go to, we've got a number of questions, and I'm sorry if we're not able to respond to everything live, so we will be providing Q&A response after that. But I'll go to Jeff. I think one or two questions that I'll send to you. There is a question about to what extent Africa can leverage the African continental FTA and other regional initiatives to deepen intra-continental trade and therefore reduce global supply shocks. So one question, and somebody else also asked the question, and I'll maybe ask Suleimanu to join you in the response, where there's a specific question targeted at him about the regional procurement strategy and whether that has been discussed already, and if yes, how advanced it is, and who is involved in a regional procurement strategy. Jeff, maybe do you want to have a go at it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a regional approach and harnessing the trade agreements, it's not only something they should do, it's something they have to do, because a lot of these products simply can't be made at scale unless there is the ability to buy them by multiple mine sites. And certainly what we see a lot across Africa is a lot of times the mining companies are actually buying most of the things they can locally that are sort of low-hanging fruit, but the next level up is something that requires coordination so that multiple mine sites aggregate demand can be combined to make a competitive factory, because certain products you just need a certain minimum level of demand to survive. And so in that regard, the only way to do this is to have some regional supply chains, unless maybe you're in a country that has just enough mines on their own. But I guess the other point there is that you can't have every country can't have make every product. I mean, there has to be some division of labor to allow those economies of scale to work. So I think in that regard, you do need to have better trade policy. And of course, you need to have better infrastructure to link the roads. But there's a lot of subtle trade policy challenges to these things. And, you know, I often use this example in Zambia, where essentially the mining companies are able to import uniforms, PPE, duty-free from Zimbabwe. But the uniform manufacturers have to pay a 25% markup duty on the materials that come in. And so no matter what you do in terms of supplier development or local content regulations, these suppliers are not going to be able to make PPE that are cheaper than the price of the direct imports from Zimbabwe. And so there really is a need to actually deeply analyze the current trade rules to make sure that they're not actually undermining the creation of SMEs to make these things. So, you know, I would say that's what needs to be done. The challenge, though, is that, you know, presidents and prime ministers are incentivized by votes from their people. So it's very difficult to kind of convince people to say, well, we're actually going to, you know, give some of these jobs to a nearby country, even if it makes the most sense overall in terms of aggregate number of jobs. It's a very big political challenge. And, you know, we already see this dynamic a lot in SADC with South Africa, where there's a lot of resentment towards South African suppliers who have an economy of scale and a number of goods and services, but it just means that there is no ability for some of these other countries to make some of the products. So I think it's a necessity to get this right, but it's very challenging.
Yeah, I think you raised a very important point of coordination across the different policies as well, because I think the African CFTA is definitely a great opportunity to remove the barriers across the different countries. But at the same time, as you were mentioning, everyone has a local content strategy, which is a national strategy, and by definition, anti-regional or anti-continental. Mm-hmm. So I think there is also this question of making sure that we find the right balance between what we want to do collectively as a group of countries to grow the pie at the regional level, and then which means that you probably will have to do less nationally. Yeah, maybe Suleiman, do you have something to add on the regional procurement strategy in West Africa? Is this something that you've been discussing already?
Yeah, it's something we've been discussing, and just early part of this year, I had planned to engage with some multilateral organizations to see whether they could support us conduct a comprehensive study. But unfortunately, COVID got in the way, and I've not been able to do that. But hopefully, I should be able to do that soon. Hopefully, I'll be able to get people on the side of the mining firms within West Africa, because you see, you really need to understand what the lay of the land is, and so otherwise you get it from the get-go. So our view is that you need to conduct a study, and once the study is conducted, we should be able to identify the areas where we can get advantage and value for the whole of West Africa. I think I like what Jeff also spoke about, the need for trade policy. Oftentimes, when local content policies are being enacted, they tend to be in silos. So they're either in the Ministry of Trade or the Ministry of Mines, and there's no conversation at all about, you know, what the impact will be on local industry. So it's important that these conversations are quite comprehensive. For example, in the case of Ghana, taking note of what this potential fallout would be, what we have in law is that, look, any product which is placed on the procurement list, which companies would have to procure locally, then there's a provision that eventually this product will be taken off the mining list, i.e., when any company brings this product in, they will have to pay the full duties and taxes on it. So it's important that, and for me, that is a key lesson, that even as you want to do local procurement, you don't have to be theoretical. Make sure that you don't do it in silos. Make sure that it is as comprehensive as possible nationwide. Various sectors which could be impacted are also part of the conversation. Then you can have a comprehensive local content policy and legislation. So the question of regional value chains is early days yet, but it is something which we are quite keen upon as the Ghana Chamber of Mines and then the ECOWAS Federation of Chamber of Mines. I know some work was done around the aluminum value chain. I saw bits and pieces of this. I'm not too sure who actually initiated the study, but it was an eye-opener. And the issue around which country does what around the regional value chain was actually discussed. And I remember making inputs. For example, the aluminum value chain, where would the rollers be? Where would the smelter be? Where would the refinery be? Of course, when it comes to the mines, it's no brainer. You have Guinea, you also have Ghana having some of the bauxite. But then the question around who, for example, will produce caustic soda for production, what are the determinants, and so on and so forth. So that for me was quite enlightening. But I'm not too sure how far this work has gone. I think it was done by Paul Jordan. I'm not too sure who actually initiated it. But yeah, so that's the only example I've seen of a regional value chain, even that is supposed to be in draft, and I'm not too sure how it ended. But yes, it's something we need to look at West Africa, especially around the gold mining industry. You see, even as you are talking about gold and you are talking about the aluminum value chain, a key component of the aluminum value chain is caustic soda, which is also a major input for gold production in West Africa, and even to some extent, even sodium cyanide production, because caustic soda is the base for the production of sodium cyanide. So these are the linkages which we actually need to take advantage of. Besides the studies, we need to expedite action and taking the critical decisions. And there should be trade-offs by all means, because in any case, one country cannot produce everything. And in fact, as we speak now, most of us tend to be importing these strategic inputs. So if a neighboring country in West Africa is actually positioned to produce it, I think we should take it in good stead, especially when it is known that the value would be retained within West Africa. I'm sure some compromises would have to be made. All of these things, they are usually trade-offs, just to make sure that countries don't feel hard done by. Again, there's also the issue of security of supply. So although, for example, Nigeria being a big brother, they have a competitive advantage to actually host the production of an input around the gold or aluminum value chain, you need to make sure that you also diversify even within West Africa, so that where there's a disruption in, say, a Nigeria or Guinea, it doesn't really adversely affect the whole of the region. So these are some of the considerations which will ultimately, determine which countries will host which components of the regional value chain. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Suleiman. That was really interesting. We were talking about the study. I think it was the AMDC who initiated the study, and yes, it was Paul Jordan.
Yeah, because I remember he had some interesting conversations with me, and we need to do a lot more. And beyond the studies, we need to see the finalization of these reports, so to translate into concrete action.
Yeah, and I think there are also some other interesting initiatives. They did the same for the SADC region. So there's some cross-learning also to see what kind of regional value chain analysis is going on in the other parts of the continent. And
that's right.
Yeah. So I'll go to Usman. I think there is a question for you, Usman. Someone is asking, in the DRC, the government is encouraging small-scale miners in the cobalt sector to continue to work despite the crisis. And he's asking, how can the large-scale mining sector and downstream assist small-scale miners? I think I realized we only talked about large-scale mining, but since you are on the board of the National Agency for Small-Scale Mining, maybe you could share a bit with us your insights on to what extent large-scale mining can support small-scale mining in this pandemic to help them weather the challenges.
Okay. Thank you, Isabel. So to respond to the question, so in Burkina Faso, we have the National Agency for the Formalization of Artisanal and Small-Scale Mining. I am the chairman of the board of this agency. So this agency receives some support from the government, from the private sector, I mean the mining company, to better manage and better support the artisanal miners. For example, here we have a good relationship between the industrial mining and small-scale mining. When the artisanal miners want to mine a site, usually this site is located in maybe in industrial license. So we help them to discuss with the industrial mining to give them a piece of land to do the artisanal mining. So this is a key example for the in terms of good a relationship between industrial mining and a small scale mining. Sure, it's not always perfect, but we are working on it. So also in terms of supervising them, we are providing them with some equipments to help them produce, because this production the agency is going to buy it, to take it. So we have now cover a good part of the country, because we are now developing through the country. We have cover a southern part of the country, and this model is working very well. We want to multiply this model throughout the country. So the difficulties the artisanal miners meet in this COVID pandemic period is they have the gold, but they couldn't sell it because the borders are closed. So the government support the agency to collect this gold, but it was not enough. But it was quite interesting, because it helped them to sell the gold in the right price, because as the buyers cannot get in the country, some people go to buy the gold with lower prices. So it was not good. So in terms of managing the artisanal miner sector, Burkina Faso, we are improving, but still some work to do. That's the situation I can make from artisanal mining sector in Burkina Faso.
Thanks a lot. We have a lot of questions. I have about 15 questions in front of me that I don't think we'll be able to answer now. So what I suggest is that I'll share the list of questions to the speakers, and if they can provide us some bullet points, we will also complement. And then we will post the Q&A blog on our website in the next couple of days. But now I'm just looking at the time, we have 4 minutes left to the end. So I'll maybe give a last word to each of the 4 speakers if they want to share with us a final insight on probably how do you see the next couple of months or weeks unfolding based on your different experiences and the areas where you come from, and to what extent you think supply chains and your sectors will be able to manage the crisis. Just 2 minutes each before we close the webinar. Thank you. Do you want to go first, Jeff?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of reflecting on what has to happen next, I think that the first step is to measure. And I think, luckily, in some ways, this has already been enforced, because whenever there was a direct shortage of, for example, right away, is fairly obvious because they're already dealing with that. So there is going to be a list, for example, of goods and services which automatically we already know, are risky, and put the entire sector and individual mine sites at risk. So I think we're going to sort of start off with that, and then hopefully we can get to a point where governments and industry are more proactive in measuring and compiling information on this. And there is obviously a challenge of things like antitrust laws and not sharing too much information to each other, but there's got to be some means of pooling information so that the industry can work with everybody to move forward in a way which not only reduces the negative potential impacts on local content, but also it improves the risk environment for those mines to actually operate. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Usman.
So, thank you. I want to, first of all, thank you for this opportunity given to me to make the situation of Burkina Faso mining sector in terms of COVID-19 impact. So this shows us that we have to think about the local content. When I say local content, it's not only in terms of country, Burkina Faso, but also regional. What I want to mention also is that ECOWAS scheduled meeting. It was actually it was in this month, May, in Abuja, but was postponed because of COVID-19. It was to talk about this local content in terms of regional. So for me, it's important to us. I mean, West African countries. To give an example, West African countries to meet together, so to have a regional strategy in terms of local content. Maybe we can share some the things. You can say maybe for the cyanide. Let me say the cyanide. Ghana will produce the cyanide. Cote d'Ivoire will produce the caustic soda. And Burkina Faso will set up a good refining. So we can maybe share the roles and share the industry. So to make this local content work better, because it's not easy for one country to have all these industries in terms of market and so on. It's not manageable. So I can say thank you, Isabel. Thank you for Jeff for giving me this opportunity to talk about Burkina Faso mining sector and local content policy. Thank you.
Thank you for your time and for sharing your experience with us. So Manu, from the industry's perspective, can you share with us your last thought about strategic thinking moving forward?
I think naturally companies would want to start thinking about the extent of their dependency on single foreign suppliers and how to mitigate these strategic vulnerabilities. There's no simple answer, but the reality is that this would be a wake-up call to say, can we continue business as usual, even post-COVID? These are questions which, practically strategy departments of most mining companies will be asking themselves. And we at the chamber ourselves, I think, is one of the things we'll be discussing, that this certainly is a wake-up call. And yes, we are quite keen in promoting local content, and we mean it. But what can we do to expedite action to ensure that we have the local suppliers very, very close to us, if not within Ghana, probably somewhere within West Africa, so that we can, take advantage of these supply chains which are close to us as much as possible. So yes, hopefully things would come back to normal soon, but these searching questions would have to be asked, and we need to have answers going forward, both at the national level and also at the regional level.
Thank you. Kathy, you have the last word.
Thanks, Isabel. Sorry, and I know we're short on time. Just one couple comments. Somebody asked about West Africa local procurement. I mean, the World Bank did prepare a guide for increasing West Africa local procurement in mining sector, and it's very comprehensive. So if you Google that, you will find it. It's a good starting guide on regionalization and how to increase local content. And I think the other content, just in terms of, you know, what we do see, the distortions as a company, is that we are trying to increase local content, but that these distorted policies where it becomes more expensive from a tax perspective to source locally, because the government has put in, you know, 20% VAT to source from a local supplier, whereas then we would get 20, that would be waived if we brought it in from a foreign company or outside the country. That's a distortion which governments can eliminate, you know, pretty easily, which would actually is one measure that increases local procurement. You know, so as I mentioned earlier, you know, all of this stuff about localization and regionalization, this is something which as an industry we've been trying to do, and as Shell we've been trying to do, but we can't build up the entire SME capacity. We can't build up every single company in a locality. So that's not our strength as an oil and gas company. But I think in partnership with donors, with the private sector, and with ourselves, we can be quite a powerful force if those three sort of pillars exist. And that should be how it's done, so that you improve sustainability while delivering local content impact in the long run.
Okay, thank you very much. We're like 2 minutes late, so let me thank you all for having joined us. Let me thank you, the four of you, for your time, and the other 150 people who were on the other side for having joined us and stayed until the end. As I said, the webinar has been recorded, so it will be posted online tomorrow. And then we'll go through the list of questions and provide some insights on the Q and the questions that you've asked. Just two announcements. The next two webinars, COVID-related webinars that IGF is organizing. There is one on May 29th on mining tax policy and administration responses to COVID-19 in Spanish. And then another one on June 10th, and this will be again by us, those working on local content. The theme will be COVID-19 and employment in the mining sector. So I look forward to having you again, and thanks a lot, and have a good end of afternoon for those on this side of the world, and for those on the other side of the Atlantic, and for a full day. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining, and looking forward to having you again next time. Thank you.